I arrived at my little brother's wedding full of happiness after sacrificing years of my life to help raise him. But my name card read poor uneducated sister living off her brother. The bride's family burst out laughing. I was ready to swallow the shame and leave until my brother held my hand and said, "You just made the most expensive mistake of your life." The room fell dead silent for a few seconds, except he was not talking to his future father-in-law. He was looking right at me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the very person you sacrificed everything for. My name is Nia, and I am 34 years old. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of love and family. I was walking into the Kensington Country Club, a sprawling private estate of manicured lawns and marble columns that screamed old money and absolute exclusivity. This was where my 26-year-old brother Jamal was marrying Chloe Kensington. Chloe was 24, the incredibly spoiled daughter of William Kensington, a ruthless real estate tycoon who practically owned half the city. From the very moment Jamal and Chloe started dating, the racial and class divide between our families was glaringly obvious. Jamal and I grew up in a modest neighborhood where every single dollar had to be stretched to the absolute limit. When our parents passed away unexpectedly in a car accident, I was only 19 years old. I dropped out of college without a second thought to raise Jamal. I worked double shifts, waited tables, and scrubbed floors just to make sure he could go to a prestigious university and have the life our parents had always dreamed for him. Now he was stepping into a world of immense wealth, a world that made it very clear I did not belong. I walked into the grand ballroom wearing a tailored emerald silk suit. It was understated but elegant, completely different from the heavily sequined, extravagant gowns the Kensington women were wearing. I smiled at the usher at the front entrance and gave my name, fully expecting to be directed to the front row with the groom's family. Instead, his polite, professional smile faltered. He checked his guest list, twice cleared his throat nervously, and pointed me toward the very back of the room, right next to the swinging doors of the busy catering kitchen. I navigated through the sea of wealthy guests, trying to keep my head held high. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the soft hum of a live string quartet seemed to mock the sudden heavy feeling growing in my chest. When I finally reached the small, poorly decorated table hidden in the shadows, I found my seat. There was a beautifully embossed place card resting on the center of my gold-rimmed plate. I picked it up, expecting to see my name written in elegant cursive calligraphy. Instead, the words printed there made my blood run absolutely cold. It read, "Poor uneducated sister living off her brother." A sharp, cruel burst of laughter erupted from a few tables over. I looked up and saw Chloe, radiant in her custom designer wedding gown, surrounded by her wealthy bridesmaids. They were all pointing directly at me, covering their mouths as they giggled like vicious high school bullies. Chloe raised her expensive champagne glass in my direction with a mocking, condescending smirk. The humiliation washed over me in hot, suffocating waves. I had given up my youth, my education, and my own dreams so Jamal could stand in this luxurious room today. And this was my reward. Being treated like an embarrassing stain on his perfect new life. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I took a deep breath, carefully set the insulting card back down on the plate, picked up my purse, and turned around to leave the venue. I was completely done. But before I could take 5 steps toward the exit, a hand clamped down hard on my wrist. I turned around, fully expecting to see my brother coming to my defense, ready to apologize for his bride's horrific behavior and demand respect for the woman who raised him. Jamal stood there looking incredibly handsome in his custom tuxedo, but his face was twisted with an intense anger I had never seen before. "You just made the most expensive mistake of your life, Naya," he hissed through gritted teeth. I stared at him in pure confusion. I genuinely thought he was talking to William, who had just walked up behind him, but Jamal's furious eyes were locked solely on me. Before I could even ask what he meant, Jamal reached out and forcefully yanked the pearl necklace I was wearing right off my neck. The sudden violent movement snapped the delicate clasp, and a few loose pearls clattered loudly onto the polished marble floor. I gasped, stumbling back and clutching my chest. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking from the shock of his physical aggression. "Do not play dumb with me," Jamal sneered, holding the pearls up as if they were hard evidence in a criminal courtroom. "Chloe told me everything. She saw you sneaking around the private bridal suite earlier today. I cannot believe you actually stole her grandmother's vintage pearls just to come out here and pretend you are something you are not. Are you really that desperate to look rich in front of her family?" I was absolutely paralyzed by the accusation. Steal. I had not even been upstairs all evening. Those pearls were a gift I had bought for myself to celebrate a recent business milestone. But before I could defend myself, William Kensington stepped into the circle, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a look of utter disgust on his face. "Let us be completely honest here," William said, his voice booming over the quiet whispers of the surrounding guests who had stopped to watch the drama. "We all know your background, Nia. You dropped out of community college at 19 to wait tables and clean up after people. Now that Jamal is officially part of a high society family, you thought you could just waltz in here, steal some priceless jewelry, and beg him for handouts. Well, the free ride is officially over. You are not going to drag this boy back down to the gutter with you." I looked from William's smug face to Jamal, desperately waiting for my brother to tell this man the truth about how hard I worked for him. I waited for him to explain that the money from waiting those tables paid for his expensive suits and his college tuition. But Jamal just looked away, ashamed to even be associated with me in front of his new wealthy family. William snapped his fingers loudly, signaling two massive security guards who immediately stepped forward and grabbed my arms. "Take this thief to the back," William ordered coldly, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Calculate whatever she ate from the buffet, charge her for the dinner bill, and then throw her out on the street where she belongs." The rough grip of the security guards on my arms was a stark reminder of the reality I was currently facing. They did not care that I was a guest. They did not care that I was the groom's sister. To them, I was exactly what William Kensington had labeled me: a trespasser, a thief, someone who did not belong. They hauled me forcefully backward through a set of heavy swinging doors, completely cutting off the soft string music and the clinking champagne glasses of the grand ballroom. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted from opulent luxury to the harsh, sterile reality of the service corridors. The blinding fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead, casting harsh shadows against the pale concrete walls. A few catering staff members paused their frantic running, holding trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres to stare at me with wide, curious eyes as I was marched down the hallway like a common criminal. I kept my chin raised and my spine perfectly straight. I refused to stumble. I refused to let the staff see any fear in my eyes. The guards shoved me into a small, windowless security office near the loading dock. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. A stark metal desk sat in the center of the cramped space, covered in clipboards and radio equipment. The larger of the two guards forced me down into a hard plastic chair, while the other moved to block the only exit, standing with his arms crossed over his massive chest. I sat there in the heavy silence, adjusting the cuffs of my emerald silk suit. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but externally I projected nothing but absolute ice. Before the guards could even begin their interrogation, the office door swung open with a violent crash. Chloe marched into the tiny room, her voluminous custom designer wedding gown taking up almost all the available space. She looked ridiculous standing in a dingy security office surrounded by filing cabinets, but the vicious, triumphant smile on her face made her look downright dangerous. She was holding her latest model smartphone up high with the camera lens pointed directly at my face and the red recording light blinking steadily. "Smile for the camera, Nia?" She taunted, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness. "I am documenting this little incident for our security files. And honestly, I might just share it with my followers. I think the world needs to see exactly what happens when ghetto trash tries to crash high society." She stepped closer, shoving the phone inches from my nose. "Say hi to all your friends back at the diner, Nia. Tell them how you tried to steal my grandmother's priceless pearls just to pretend you are someone important. Tell them how my husband finally saw you for the pathetic leech you really are." I stared directly into the camera lens without blinking. I did not raise my hands to cover my face. I did not cower. I let her record my absolute composure. Her words were meant to break me, to reduce me to a sobbing, defensive mess. She wanted me to scream and beg and prove her narrative right. But I had spent the last decade negotiating with ruthless corporate sharks who would eat a spoiled little girl like Chloe for breakfast. Her high school bullying tactics meant absolutely nothing to me. When I did not react, Chloe scowled, dropping the phone slightly. She turned to the security manager who had just walked into the room carrying a leather-bound folder. "Did you calculate the damages?" she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at me. She ruined the mood of my entire reception. She caused a scene. She broke vintage jewelry. I want her charged for everything. The security manager looked uncomfortable, but he nodded obediently. He opened the folder and placed it on the metal desk in front of me. Inside was an itemized invoice printed on the country club's official letterhead. My eyes scanned the bold numbers at the bottom of the page. $5,000. They were charging me $5,000 for a dinner I had barely touched, for the pearls that I had purchased myself, and for the supposed emotional distress I had caused the bride. "You are going to sign that credit card slip right now," Chloe ordered, leaning over the desk to glare at me. "You are going to pay for the disruption you caused my family. If you do not have the money, which we all know you do not, my father is calling the police. We will have you arrested for grand larceny and trespassing. Have fun explaining that to whatever minimum wage boss you work for." The security manager cleared his throat, tapping a pen against the desk. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me with a stiff, professional tone, "I suggest you provide a payment method immediately. Mr. Kensington has made it clear that we are to pursue maximum legal action if this bill is not settled in full tonight." I looked at the invoice again. The sheer audacity of these people was suffocating. They genuinely believed I was a helpless, uneducated woman who would crumble under the weight of their white wealth and privilege. They thought I was going to drop to my knees and beg for mercy, pleading for Jamal to save me from financial ruin. But Jamal had already made his choice out there in the ballroom. He had chosen them, and now the Kensingtons were about to find out exactly who they had just provoked. A slow, icy smile touched the corners of my mouth. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of defense. I simply reached down and unclasped my handbag. Chloe let out a high-pitched, mocking laugh. "What are you doing?" "Looking for coupons." "I am sorry, honey, but they do not accept food stamps at the Kensington Country Club. And be careful with that bag. The fake leather looks like it is about to peel right off. You really should not buy knockoffs from street vendors if you are going to pretend to be rich." I completely ignored her pathetic commentary. My bag was a genuine Hermes Birkin special ordered from Paris, a reward I had bought myself after closing my first $50 million real estate acquisition. I bypassed my regular banking debit cards and my standard business credit cards. My fingers brushed against the cool, heavy metal of a card I rarely used in public because it usually drew too much unwanted attention. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the metal desk right on top of the $5,000 invoice. The card landed with a solid metallic clink that sounded completely different from a standard piece of plastic. It was a Black Centurion card, the ultimate symbol of limitless financial power. It was the kind of card you could not simply apply for online. You had to be personally invited by the financial institution to carry it, usually only after maintaining tens of millions of dollars in personal assets and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. "Charge it," I said, my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. "Charge the full $5,000. In fact, make it $10,000. You can distribute the rest as a tip to the catering staff your family has been screaming at all evening." Chloe scoffed, clearly believing the heavy metal card was some sort of novelty fake or a prepaid debit card painted black. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her chest. "Oh, please. Run it," she commanded the security manager. "Let us see how long it takes for the machine to decline that piece of garbage. And then I am calling the authorities myself." The security manager, however, did not laugh. He worked at an exclusive country club and dealt with wealthy clients every single day. He recognized the distinct weight and the sleek titanium finish of the card sitting on his desk. He hesitated for a brief second, looking from the card to my perfectly calm face. His hands were actually trembling slightly as he picked it up and walked over to the processing terminal on the corner of the desk. The tiny security office fell completely silent. The only sound was the mechanical swiping of the heavy metal card through the terminal, followed by the rhythmic beeping of the machine dialing out to process the transaction. Chloe held her phone steady, keeping the camera focused tightly on my face, eagerly waiting for the moment the machine would blare a loud rejection. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, ready to capture my ultimate humiliation. Then the machine let out a single high-pitched beep. A bright green light flashed across the digital screen. Approved. The security manager gasped softly. He stared at the printed receipt as it began to roll rapidly out of the machine, slicing the silence with its mechanical clicking. He swallowed hard, looking from the slip of paper to me and then over to Chloe. The color had completely drained from his face, and a light sheen of sweat had formed on his forehead. "Well," Chloe snapped impatiently, tapping her foot against the linoleum floor. "Did it decline? Call the police right now." "Ma'am." The security guard mumbled, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. "It went through. It is fully approved for $10,000. Chloe's smug, triumphant smile vanished instantly. She lowered her phone, her mouth falling slightly open in total shock. "That is impossible," she snapped, marching over to the desk. "Run it again. It has to be a mistake. She stole that card." Before the manager could respond, the office door swung open again. William Kensington strode into the room, adjusting his expensive silk tie. His face was flushed with impatience and irritation. "Is the trash dealt with yet?" William demanded, looking directly at the security manager. "Tell me you have her signature on the invoice so we can throw her out of my property. I want her gone before the cake cutting." The security manager did not say a word. His hands were shaking violently as he tore the merchant copy of the receipt from the machine and held it out toward William. William snatched the receipt out of the man's hand, his face twisted into a fierce scowl. He glared at the small slip of paper, fully expecting to see a declined message or a payment agreement plan. But as William's eyes scanned the printed text, they suddenly locked onto the corporate account name printed in bold black ink, right below the massive $10,000 transaction amount. The arrogant, aggressive posture William had carried all night evaporated in a fraction of a second. The deep red flush of anger on his cheeks was instantly replaced by a sickening, ghostly pallor. He brought the receipt closer to his face, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. His breathing hitched loudly in the quiet room. He stared at the name printed on the paper as if it were a death sentence. "Vanguard Holdings," William whispered. His voice was so faint, it sounded like all the air had been violently crushed out of his lungs. He looked up slowly, his terrified eyes meeting my calm, steady gaze. He took a stumbling step backward, his hand gripping the edge of a filing cabinet to keep himself upright. "Vanguard Holdings. Impossible. This is impossible." The sun had barely risen over the city skyline when the financial news channels began broadcasting the absolute collapse of the Kensington Group. I stood in the kitchen of my penthouse apartment, sipping a hot cup of black coffee while watching the television screen mounted on the wall. The bright red ticker at the bottom of the screen showed Kensington stock in a total freefall. The anchors were scrambling to explain how Vanguard Holdings, the notoriously private and ruthless equity firm, had abruptly pulled out of a massive $100 million bridge loan at the 11th hour. Rumors of bankruptcy were already swirling. William Kensington was bleeding millions of dollars by the minute. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling completely at peace. My private elevator chimed, signaling an unexpected arrival. I had not authorized anyone to come up, but my building security knew my brother was on the access list. The heavy oak doors slid open and Jamal stormed into my foyer. He looked like an absolute wreck. He was still wearing the trousers from his expensive wedding tuxedo, but his shirt was untucked and wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was twisted with the same vicious anger he had shown me the night before. He marched straight into the kitchen and slammed his hands down on the marble island. "You ruined everything," he yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I stared at him, refusing to flinch. I asked him why he was in my home after having me thrown out of his wedding like a common criminal. Jamal ignored my question and started pacing across the floor. He blamed me for the disaster of his wedding night. He said Chloe spent her entire wedding night crying because her black credit cards were suddenly declined when they tried to book their private jet to the Maldives. He said the Kensington family was dealing with a massive corporate emergency because some greedy anonymous equity firm was trying to destroy them. And somehow in his twisted mind, he blamed my appearance at the wedding for bringing bad luck to his perfect new, wealthy family. "You owe me, Nia," he demanded, pointing an aggressive finger at me. "Our parents told you to take care of me. They told you to make sure I succeeded. Well, my new family is in trouble and I need you to fix it." I raised an eyebrow, setting my coffee mug down on the counter. I asked him exactly how he expected the poor, uneducated sister to fix a multi-million-dollar corporate liquidity crisis. Jamal reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled legal document, throwing it onto the marble island. "It is a loan guarantor form," he demanded. "William needs a short-term cash injection just to keep the construction crews working on his hotel until the banks open on Monday. I know you have been hoarding cash from your little real estate hustles. You never spend money on anything nice for yourself. You probably have a few $100,000 sitting in a savings account. Sign the paper and put your assets up as collateral. If you do not do this, Chloe will never forgive me, and the Kensingtons will think I am useless." I looked down at the paper and then back up at the brother I had sacrificed my entire youth for. He was standing there demanding that I risk my own financial security to save the exact same man who had ordered security to drag me out of a ballroom just 12 hours earlier. The sheer entitlement was breathtaking. I told him no. I said it with absolute finality. Jamal's face turned a violent shade of red. He slammed his fist on the counter again and unleashed a torrent of insults. He told me I was selfish. He told me I would always be a bitter, lonely woman from the bottom of the social ladder. He said I was jealous of Chloe because she had class and beauty and came from a world I could never possibly understand. He called me bottom-tier trash who was trying to sabotage his rise to high society. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply turned around and walked over to the built-in wall safe hidden behind a modern painting in my study. I entered the code, pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound ledger, and walked back to the kitchen. I dropped it onto the marble island right on top of his ridiculous loan document. The heavy thud made Jamal jump back. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him to open it. When he hesitated, I flipped the cover open myself. Inside were 10 years of meticulously kept financial records and receipts. I pointed to the first page. "That is the receipt for your first semester of tuition at Yale. I worked 18-hour days scrubbing floors and serving food to people just like William Kensington to pay that bill." I flipped to the next page. "That is the lease agreement for your luxury apartment in Manhattan. I paid your rent for 3 entire years so you could intern at prestigious firms without taking out student loans." I flipped another page. "And that right there is the receipt for the custom engagement ring you gave Chloe, the diamond you swore you bought with your own hard-earned savings." Jamal stared at the pages, the color slowly draining from his face, as the undeniable proof of his complete dependence on me stared right back at him. "You did not build yourself, Jamal," I said, my voice dangerously quiet but echoing with power. "I built you. I paid for the designer suits you wear. I funded the education that got you in the door. I gave you the polished upper-class illusion that allowed you to trick the Kensington family into thinking you were one of them. You are not high society. You are a complete fraud living on my dime. And as of last night, you cut the cord." Before Jamal could even process the reality of my words, the private elevator chimed again. The door slid open to reveal William Kensington and Chloe. Chloe looked like a complete disaster. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled, and her eyes were swollen from crying. William looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. His usual arrogant posture was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. He marched into my apartment looking around at the multi-million-dollar view and the expensive artwork with a look of utter confusion before his face hardened into a scowl. He had clearly expected to find me in a rundown studio apartment, not a luxury penthouse that rivaled his own mansion. William threw a thick legal packet onto the kitchen counter, completely ignoring Jamal, who was still staring at the ledger of his own financial failures. It was a formal cease and desist order. "Listen to me very carefully," William barked, trying desperately to project the authority he had wielded the night before. "I do not know how you managed to scam your way into an apartment like this, but your little stunt at my daughter's wedding caused a media nightmare. I am dealing with a corporate crisis this morning, and I do not have time for your ghetto drama. You are going to sign this order. You are going to legally agree to stay away from my daughter, my son-in-law, and my business. If you ever contact my family again or attempt to extort us, I will have my lawyers tie you up in court until you are bankrupt and living on the street." Chloe stepped up behind her father, crossing her arms. She looked at me with pure venom. "You ruined my wedding night," she sneered. "You are a toxic, jealous loser, and you will never be part of this family. Sign the paper so we never have to look at your ugly face again." Jamal finally snapped out of his shock and grabbed Chloe by the arm, begging her to calm down, completely terrified of the scene unfolding in my kitchen. But I just smiled. A genuine warm smile that made William Kensington shift uncomfortably on his feet. I picked up the expensive fountain pen resting next to the ledger. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I leaned over the marble island and signed my name on the bottom line of his cease and desist order with a smooth, elegant flourish. I slid the paper back across the counter toward William. "I am more than happy to sign this, William," I said, maintaining direct eye contact. "I have absolutely no desire to ever be near your family again. But I do think it is incredibly ironic that you are standing in my home threatening a woman with bankruptcy when your own company is exactly 24 hours away from total liquidation." William froze. His eyes narrowed and a look of deep uncertainty crossed his face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. I folded my hands and rested them on the cool marble. "I am talking about Vanguard Holdings," I said softly. "I am talking about the $100 million bridge loan you desperately needed to save your luxury hotel project. The loan that was just canceled this morning." William stepped back as if I had physically struck him. His breathing became shallow and rapid. "How could you possibly know about that?" he whispered. "That information was strictly confidential. Only the board of directors and the chief executive officer of Vanguard knew about the cancellation." I tilted my head, projecting absolute dominance. "I know about it, William, because I am the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I am the anonymous founder who owns 80% of your corporate debt. And I am the person who just gave the order to completely dismantle your empire." The silence in the room was absolute. Chloe looked back and forth between me and her father, not fully understanding the financial terminology, but clearly sensing the catastrophic shift in power. Jamal stood frozen, his mouth hanging open as the truth finally crashed down on him. The sister he had abandoned, the woman he thought was a poor, uneducated beggar, was the billionaire equity titan who held his new family's entire existence in the palm of her hand. Right at that exact moment, William's cell phone began to ring. The shrill sound cut through the silence like a knife. He pulled it out of his pocket with trembling hands. I could see the caller ID flashing on the screen. It was his chief financial officer. William slowly lifted the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving my face. "Yes," William answered, his voice shaking. He listened for only a few seconds. I watched the remaining blood drain completely from his face until he looked like a ghost. He dropped the phone, letting it clatter loudly onto the marble island. "They issued a margin call," William whispered, his voice breaking. "Vanguard just issued a 48-hour ultimatum. They are demanding immediate payment in full for all outstanding debts. If we do not pay by Monday morning, they are seizing everything. The country club, the hotels, the corporate accounts, everything." Chloe stared at her father, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. She grabbed his arm, shaking him aggressively. She demanded to know what he was talking about. She yelled that she had a private jet booked for their honeymoon in the Maldives, and she was not going to let some stupid corporate glitch ruin her perfect week. William slowly turned his head to look at his spoiled daughter. The absolute despair in his eyes made Chloe take a step back. He told her there was no jet. There was no honeymoon. There was no money left. William's knees suddenly gave out. The great real estate tycoon, the man who had mocked my background and ordered me thrown out of a ballroom like common trash, was now kneeling on the polished hardwood floor of my kitchen. He looked up at me with tears welling in his eyes. He begged for mercy. He promised to give me a controlling stake in his company. He offered to publicly apologize to me in front of all his wealthy friends. He even offered to immediately sign over the deed to the Kensington Country Club if I would just reverse the margin call and give him 30 days to find the cash. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. I told him his company was completely worthless. I explained how his arrogance had blinded him to the market. He had over-leveraged every single one of his assets to maintain a fake luxurious lifestyle just to impress people who did not actually care about him. I informed him that I did not want a seat on his sinking ship because I had bought the entire ocean specifically to watch him drown. I reminded him of how he treated me at the wedding. He had ordered his security guards to throw me out on the street. Now I was throwing his entire legacy out on the street. Jamal watched his powerful father-in-law groveling on the floor like a defeated animal. The illusion of the mighty Kensington family shattered right in front of his eyes. He realized he had abandoned the only person who ever truly loved him for a family of bankrupt frauds. Jamal turned to Chloe, expecting her to comfort him or stand by his side. Instead, Chloe shoved him away with vicious force. She screamed that this was all his fault. She said she never would have married a charity case if she knew his sister was going to destroy her life. The mask of true love evaporated instantly. Chloe admitted right there in my kitchen that she only wanted Jamal because he looked good in photographs, and she thought she could control a man who had no money of his own. She called him a pathetic loser and demanded that her father do something to fix the situation. William just stayed on the floor holding his head in his hands, sobbing quietly. Jamal looked like he had been physically struck by a freight train. The superficial world he had sold his soul to join was collapsing into dust. He turned back to me, tears streaming down his face. He called my name, his voice cracking with desperation. He reminded me of our parents. He begged me to remember how I used to hold him when he was a little boy. He said he was brainwashed by the Kensingtons and their money. He claimed he was so sorry and that we could go back to being a real family if I just helped him out of this nightmare. I picked up the heavy leather ledger and the cease and desist order from the Marble Island. I handed them both to Jamal. I told him our parents asked me to raise a good man, but I had failed entirely. I had raised a parasite who valued expensive suits over loyalty. I reminded him that less than 10 minutes ago, he was screaming at me to risk my own financial security to save his wealthy in-laws. I pointed out that he had stood by and watched his bride accuse me of theft without saying a single word in my defense. He had made his choice. I walked over to the console on my kitchen wall and pressed the security intercom button. I summoned my private building security. When the two massive guards stepped out of the private elevator, I looked at William and Chloe and Jamal. I used the exact same words William had used the night before. I told my guards to take these trespassers to the back and throw them out on the street where they belong. The guards grabbed William by the arms, hauling him up from the floor. Chloe screamed and kicked, thrashing wildly and threatening to sue everyone in the building as they escorted her to the elevator. Jamal did not fight. He walked into the elevator with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking as he sobbed uncontrollably. The heavy silver doors slid shut, cutting off Chloe's frantic screaming. The profound silence returned to my penthouse. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow sip, and looked out over the city. It was going to be a beautiful day. By Monday morning, the financial world was in a complete frenzy. Vanguard Holdings officially seized all collateral tied to the Kensington Group. The corporate takeover was brutal, swift, and entirely legal. William Kensington was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Tuesday afternoon. The fallout was magnificent. Federal investigators raided his corporate offices on Wednesday, uncovering years of tax fraud and severe embezzlement that he had used to fund his family's lavish lifestyle. William was facing serious prison time, and his assets were frozen globally. Chloe's pristine high society image was destroyed overnight. Paparazzi captured humiliating photos of her crying on the curb in her designer sweatpants as moving trucks cleared out her luxury mansion. Her wealthy friends abandoned her, instantly blocking her phone number and ignoring her pleas for financial help. In the cutthroat world of high society, bankruptcy is treated like a highly contagious disease, and absolutely no one wanted to catch it. She was forced to move into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, a spectacular fall from grace for a girl who had mocked me for supposedly looking poor. Jamal filed for an annulment less than a week later, claiming he was defrauded by the Kensington family. But the damage to his own life was already permanent. With no money, no job, and no wealthy wife to support his expensive habits, he was quickly evicted from his Manhattan apartment. The prestigious internship connections he had bragged about vanished the moment they realized he no longer had the backing of the Kensington fortune. He tried to call me hundreds of times. He left desperate voicemails crying and begging for a second chance. He promised to work for me, to pay me back for everything he had taken, and to be the brother I always wanted. He even showed up at the Vanguard Holdings corporate lobby, demanding to see his sister. My security team escorted him off the premises and informed him he would be arrested for trespassing if he ever returned. I had changed my personal phone number and instructed my legal team to block any communication from him. I completely severed all ties. I had given him 10 years of my life, my youth, and my absolute devotion. I absolutely refused to give him a single second more. 6 months later, I stood on the grand balcony of the newly rebranded Vanguard Country Club. It was the exact same venue where I had been humiliated at the wedding. Now I owned the entire estate. The towering marble columns, the manicured lawns, and the sprawling grand ballroom were completely mine. I had bought the property at a steep discount during the Kensington liquidation auction. I took a sip of an incredibly rare vintage champagne and looked out over the sprawling green golf course. The evening air was crisp and clean. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the property. I had lost a brother, but I had gained my absolute freedom. The heavy, suffocating burden of raising an ungrateful child was finally lifted from my shoulders. I no longer had to stretch my budget or sacrifice my own happiness to fund someone else's unearned arrogance. The revenge had been perfectly sweet, but the absolute peace that followed, knowing I had built an untouchable empire with my own 2 hands, was 1,000 times sweeter. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. William Kensington, the ruthless tycoon who had ordered me thrown out of his property like a stray dog, was now trembling so violently he could barely stand. He reached out blindly, gripping the edge of my marble kitchen island, his knuckles turning bone white. Chloe stared at her father, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. She grabbed his arm, shaking him aggressively. She demanded to know what a margin call was. She yelled that she had a private jet booked for their honeymoon in the Maldives, and she was not going to let some stupid corporate glitch ruin her perfect week. William slowly turned his head to look at his spoiled daughter. The absolute despair in his eyes made Chloe take a step back. He told her there was no jet. There was no honeymoon. There was no money left. Jamal watched the mighty Kensington empire shatter right in front of his eyes. But instead of realizing the gravity of his own betrayal, his brain latched onto the only detail that mattered to his greedy, selfish soul. He turned to me, his eyes wide and completely deranged. A sick, twisted smile stretched across his face. "You are Vanguard," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "You are the chief executive. You have billions of dollars, Nia. You can fix this. You can wire the 100 million right now and save the hotel. Just transfer the funds and William will let us back into the family. We can all be rich together." I stared at the brother I had raised, the boy I had scrubbed floors for. He was standing in my luxury penthouse demanding that I hand over $100 million to the man who had humiliated me just so he could keep playing dress-up in high society. I am the one seizing his assets, Jamal. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. I am the one liquidating his company. I am not going to save him. I am going to bury him. That was the exact moment Jamal completely lost his mind. The realization that I was not going to be his unlimited cash supply triggered a level of viciousness I had never seen before. He slammed his fist onto the marble counter and unleashed a torrent of pure venom. He screamed that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous spinster. He mocked our background, the tiny, cramped apartment we grew up in, the cheap clothes we had to wear. He looked at my emerald silk suit and spat that no amount of money would ever wash the ghetto off me. He said I would always be bottom-tier trash, an uneducated waitress who got lucky with a few investments. He claimed he was a Kensington, now a man of class and pedigree, and that my dark skin and street hustle would never belong in his elite world. He actually stood there wearing the custom-tailored suit I had paid for, breathing the air in the penthouse I owned, and told me I was beneath him. He yelled that I was actively trying to sabotage his rise to the top because I wanted him to be as miserable and isolated as I was. He said I should be grateful he even allowed me to attend his wedding at all. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, unconditional love I had carried for my brother for 34 years finally evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard clarity. I reached down and picked up the heavy leather-bound ledger sitting on the counter. I did not just open it this time. I grabbed the thick stack of receipts, invoices, and bank statements tucked inside and hurled them violently into his chest. The papers exploded in the air, raining down around him like snow. I paid for your class, I stated, stepping forward and forcing him to back away. Every single ounce of your supposed pedigree was bought with my blood and sweat. Pick up those papers, Jamal. Pick up the receipt for your Ivy League tuition. Pick up the rent checks for your Manhattan loft. Pick up the invoice for the diamond ring you used to buy your way into that bankrupt family. You are not high society. You are a parasite who fed on my sacrifices until you found a wealthier host. Jamal stumbled back, tripping over the scattered documents. He opened his mouth to shout another insult, but he was abruptly cut off. The private elevator chimed loudly, signaling another arrival. The heavy silver doors slid open, and a tall, frantic man in a rumpled suit burst into my foyer, clutching a thick stack of legal documents. It was William, Kensington's lead corporate attorney. He had clearly run all the way from the lobby, trailing behind his boss. William, the attorney, gasped, struggling to catch his breath as he rushed into the kitchen. He held out the papers, which I instantly recognized as the physical copies of the cease and desist order they had threatened me with. I brought the court orders you wanted to file against her, but it is too late. The banks just locked us out of the corporate accounts. The commercial lenders are freezing everything. We are completely insolvent. William let out a choked sob, sliding down the side of the marble island until he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by Jamal's tuition receipts. The great tycoon was completely broken. Chloe started screaming hysterically, pulling at her hair and stamping her feet like a toddler denied a toy. She shrieked that she was not going to be poor, she was not going to lose her status, and she turned her venomous rage directly onto Jamal. She slapped his chest, pushing him backward. She screamed that this was all his fault. She said she never would have married a charity case if she knew his sister was going to destroy her life. The mask of true love evaporated instantly. Chloe admitted right there in my kitchen that she only wanted Jamal because he looked good in photographs, and she thought she could control a man who had no money of his own. She called him a pathetic loser and demanded that her father do something to fix the situation. William just stayed on the floor, holding his head in his hands, sobbing quietly. Jamal looked like he had been physically struck by a freight train. The superficial world he had sold his soul to join was collapsing into dust, and the woman he thought was his ticket to the top was looking at him with absolute disgust. He turned back to me, tears streaming down his face, his arrogant pride finally shattered. He called my name, his voice cracking with desperation. He begged me to remember how I used to hold him when he was a little boy. He claimed he was brainwashed by the Kensingtons and their money. He swore he was sorry and that we could go back to being a real family if I just stopped the foreclosure. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. I told him our parents asked me to raise a good man, but I had failed entirely. I had raised a coward who valued the illusion of wealth over loyalty. I reminded him that less than 10 minutes ago he was insulting the very hands that fed him. He had stood by and watched his bride order me thrown out on the street without saying a single word in my defense. He had made his choice. I walked over to the console on my kitchen wall and pressed the security intercom button. I summoned my private building security. When my two massive guards stepped out of the private elevator, I looked at William, Chloe, and Jamal. I used the exact same words William had used the night before. I told my guards to take these trespassers to the back and throw them out on the street where they belong. The guards grabbed William by the arms, hauling him up from the floor. Chloe screamed and kicked, thrashing wildly and threatening to sue everyone in the building as they escorted her to the elevator. Jamal did not fight. He walked into the elevator with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking as he sobbed uncontrollably. The heavy silver doors slid shut, cutting off Chloe's frantic screaming. The profound silence returned to my penthouse. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow sip, and looked out over the city. It was going to be a beautiful day. By Monday morning, the financial world was in a complete frenzy. Vanguard Holdings officially seized all collateral tied to the Kensington Group. The corporate takeover was brutal, swift, and entirely legal. William Kensington was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Tuesday afternoon. The fallout was magnificent. Federal investigators raided his corporate offices on Wednesday, uncovering years of tax fraud and severe embezzlement that he had used to fund his family's lavish lifestyle. William was facing serious prison time, and his assets were frozen globally. Chloe's pristine high society image was destroyed overnight. Paparazzi captured humiliating photos of her crying on the curb in her designer sweatpants as moving trucks cleared out her luxury mansion. Her wealthy friends abandoned her, instantly blocking her phone number and ignoring her pleas for financial help. In the cutthroat world of high society, bankruptcy is treated like a highly contagious disease, and absolutely no one wanted to catch it. She was forced to move into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, a spectacular fall from grace for a girl who had mocked me for supposedly looking poor. Jamal filed for an annulment less than a week later, claiming he was defrauded by the Kensington family. But the damage to his own life was already permanent. With no money, no job, and no wealthy wife to support his expensive habits, he was quickly evicted from his Manhattan apartment. The prestigious internship connections he had bragged about vanished the moment they realized he no longer had the backing of the Kensington fortune. He tried to call me hundreds of times. He left desperate voicemails crying and begging for a second chance. He promised to work for me, to pay me back for everything he had taken, and to be the brother I always wanted. He even showed up at the Vanguard Holdings corporate lobby, demanding to see his sister. My security team escorted him off the premises and informed him he would be arrested for trespassing if he ever returned. I had changed my personal phone number and instructed my legal team to block any communication from him. I completely severed all ties. I had given him 10 years of my life, my youth, and my absolute devotion. I absolutely refused to give him a single second more. 6 months later, I stood on the grand balcony of the newly rebranded Vanguard Country Club. It was the exact same venue where I had been humiliated at the wedding. Now I owned the entire estate. The towering marble columns, the manicured lawns, and the sprawling grand ballroom were completely mine. I had bought the property at a steep discount during the Kensington liquidation auction. I took a sip of an incredibly rare vintage champagne and looked out over the sprawling green golf course. The evening air was crisp and clean. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the property. I had lost a brother, but I had gained my absolute freedom. The heavy, suffocating burden of raising an ungrateful child was finally lifted from my shoulders. I no longer had to stretch my budget or sacrifice my own happiness to fund someone else's unearned arrogance. The revenge had been perfectly sweet. But the absolute peace that followed knowing I had built an untouchable empire with my own 2 hands was 1,000 times sweeter. The crushing weight of the word everything shattered the remaining air in the room. William Kensington collapsed. Not a stumble, not a trip, but a total physical surrender to gravity. The man who had stood on a literal pedestal just 12 hours ago demanding my removal from his pristine ballroom was now a crumpled, pathetic mass of expensive tailoring on my kitchen floor. He stared at the marble tiles, his chest heaving with sharp, erratic gasps. He was drowning. He was drowning in the exact ocean I had purchased specifically to watch him sink. Chloe blinked rapidly, her brain entirely incapable of processing the financial execution that had just occurred. She looked from the discarded phone to her father, and then to me. She grabbed William by the shoulder, shaking him with frantic, jerky movements. She demanded that he get up. She screamed that this was a sick joke. She yelled that she had a private jet waiting on the tarmac for her honeymoon to the Maldives. She yelled that her credit cards were supposed to be fixed today. She yelled that she was a Kensington, and Kensingtons did not lose. William did not look at her. He could not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his voice nothing more than a hollow, raspy whisper. There is no jet, Chloe. There is no honeymoon. There is no money left. There is absolutely nothing left. The repetition of the word, nothing, seemed to finally pierce through her delusion. Chloe let out a sound that was half shriek, half sob. She spun around and locked her eyes on Jamal. Jamal was still standing frozen near the kitchen island, staring at the open ledger that contained every single secret of his fake aristocratic existence. He was a fraud exposed in the harshest light possible. Chloe marched up to him and drove her hands hard into his chest, shoving him backward. She shrieked that this was all his fault. She screamed that he was a curse. She screamed that he brought his toxic ghetto family into her perfect world and ruined everything. Jamal reached out, trying to grab her arms, trying to utter her name, but she slapped his hands away with absolute revulsion. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are nothing," she spat, the venom dripping from every single syllable. "You are a broke, pathetic charity case. I only married you because you looked good in photos. I only married you because I thought I could control a man who had absolutely nothing of his own. You are a loser, Jamal. You are a complete loser." Jamal's face crumpled. The grand illusion of his high society life, the unconditional love he thought he had secured, the status he had traded his own flesh and blood to obtain, was evaporating right in front of his eyes. He looked at the woman he had just vowed to spend his life with and saw only a shallow, empty void. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. His eyes were red and swollen. The arrogant sneer he had worn when he stormed into my penthouse, demanding I sacrifice my savings for his father-in-law, was completely gone. In its place was the terrified little boy I had practically raised. The little boy I had protected. The little boy I had loved more than my own life. He took a step towards me, his hands trembling. "Nia," he choked out the sound barely escaping his throat. "Nia, please. Please look at me. You have to stop this. You have to fix this. We are family, Nia. We have the same blood. You raised me. You protected me. You cannot do this to me. You cannot leave me with nothing." He fell to his knees right beside William. Two men from two entirely different worlds united in their absolute defeat, groveling on my kitchen floor. Jamal reached out, trying to grab the hem of my trousers. I took a single, deliberate step back. I looked down at him and felt the final remaining thread of my maternal love for him snap. It did not break with a loud noise. It broke in complete, absolute silence. "I raised you to be a man, Jamal," I said, my voice dead and completely devoid of emotion. "I raised you to be strong. I raised you to be loyal. I paid for your education. I paid for your apartment. I paid for the very suit you are wearing to beg me. I paid for your life. I paid for your lies. I paid for your arrogance. And yesterday, when this man ordered me thrown out of your wedding like a stray dog, you stood there in silence. You watched me humiliated. You watched me discarded. You chose their money over my blood. You made your choice." Jamal sobbed heavily, his forehead resting against the cold marble floor. He begged for forgiveness. He begged for a second chance. He begged for the sister he had thrown away. I ignored him and turned my attention back to William. William was staring up at me, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat. He raised his shaking hands in a gesture of total surrender. "Miss Vanguard," he whispered, stumbling over the name. "Please. I will give you anything. I will give you 50% of the Kensington Group. I will give you a seat on the board. I will publicly apologize to you in front of the entire city. I will sign over the deed to the country club today. Just reverse the margin call. Just give me 30 days to find the liquidity. Please, do not destroy my family." I tilted my head, studying the broken tycoon. "I do not want 50% of your company, William. I do not want a seat on your board. Your company is a hollow shell built on debt and arrogant mismanagement. I do not want to partner with a sinking ship. I bought the debt specifically to sink the ship. You humiliated me because you thought I was powerless. You tried to legally threaten me because you thought I was weak. You have exactly 48 hours to pay Vanguard Holdings $100 million. If you do not, the liquidation begins." I walked over to the security panel on the wall and pressed the silver button. My private security detail stationed in the lobby was alerted immediately. I turned back to the 3 pathetic figures in my kitchen. "The game is over," I stated with absolute finality. "You will leave my home now. If you do not leave immediately, my guards will physically throw you out on the street. They will throw you out exactly like you threw me out yesterday." The private elevator chimed. 2 massive security guards stepped into the foyer, their expressions unreadable. I pointed to the kitchen. "Escort them out," I ordered. The guards moved swiftly. They grabbed William by his arms, hauling him to his feet. He offered no resistance, his spirit completely broken. Chloe screamed. She thrashed and kicked, yelling that she was going to sue me, yelling that she was a Kensington, yelling that this was illegal. The guards ignored her, pulling her toward the elevator doors. Jamal stood up on his own. He did not look at me again. He looked at the floor, his shoulders completely slumped, his entire world destroyed. He walked slowly into the elevator, joining the weeping tycoon and the screaming bride. The heavy silver doors slid shut. The noise was instantly cut off. My penthouse returned to its perfect, serene silence. I walked back to the kitchen counter, picked up my coffee mug, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was still warm. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling city skyline. The sun was fully up now, bathing the skyscrapers in a brilliant golden light. It was going to be a highly productive week. By Monday morning, the financial sector was in a state of absolute chaos. Vanguard Holdings officially executed the margin call against the Kensington Group. The corporate takeover was brutal. The takeover was swift. The takeover was entirely legal. William Kensington failed to produce the $100 million. By Tuesday afternoon, his legal team formally filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The media descended like a pack of starving wolves. The fallout was magnificent. Federal investigators raided the Kensington corporate offices on Wednesday morning. They seized hard drives, they seized physical files, they seized everything. The investigation uncovered years of severe tax fraud and massive embezzlement that William had used to artificially inflate his company's value and fund his family's luxurious lifestyle. His assets were frozen globally. He was facing federal indictment and decades in prison. Chloe's pristine high society image was obliterated in a matter of hours. The paparazzi captured humiliating photographs of her sitting on the curb outside her repossessed mansion, crying hysterically in designer sweatpants as moving trucks hauled away her furniture. Her wealthy friends abandoned her instantly. They blocked her phone numbers. They ignored her pleas for loans. They pretended they had never known her. In the cutthroat arena of high society, bankruptcy is a highly contagious disease, and absolutely no one wanted to catch it. She was forced to move into a cheap, run-down motel on the outskirts of the city. It was a spectacular, devastating fall from grace for a girl who had mocked me for looking poor. Jamal's fate was equally pathetic. He filed for an annulment less than a week after the wedding, claiming he was defrauded by the Kensington family. But the damage to his own reputation was completely irreversible. With no money, no job, and no wealthy wife to support his extravagant habits, he was quickly evicted from his Manhattan loft. The prestigious internship connections he had bragged so loudly about vanished the exact moment they realized he no longer had the financial backing of the Kensington fortune. He tried to contact me, he tried hundreds of times, he left desperate voicemails crying and pleading for a second chance. He promised to work for me. He promised to pay me back for every single cent he had taken. He promised to be the brother I always wanted. He even showed up at the Vanguard Holdings corporate lobby demanding to speak with his sister. My security team intercepted him immediately. They escorted him off the premises and informed him he would be arrested for criminal trespassing if he ever set foot near the building again. I changed my personal phone number. I instructed my legal team to permanently block any communication from him or the Kensingtons. I severed all ties. I cut the cord entirely. I had given him 10 years of my life. I had given him my youth. I had given him my absolute devotion. I absolutely refused to give him a single second more. 6 months later, I stood on the grand master balcony of the newly rebranded Vanguard Country Club. It was the exact same venue where I had been humiliated at that disastrous wedding. Now I owned the entire estate. The towering marble columns were mine. The manicured rolling lawns were mine. The sprawling grand ballroom was entirely mine. I had purchased the property at a steep discount during the Kensington liquidation auction. I held a crystal flute of an incredibly rare vintage champagne and looked out over the pristine green golf course. The evening air was crisp. The evening air was clean. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the property boundary. I had lost a brother, but I had gained my absolute freedom. The heavy, suffocating burden of raising an ungrateful child was finally lifted from my shoulders forever. I no longer had to stretch my budget. I no longer had to sacrifice my own happiness to fund someone else's unearned arrogance. The revenge had been perfectly sweet. But the absolute profound peace that followed knowing I had built an untouchable empire with my own 2 hands was 1,000 times sweeter. The clock was ticking down on my 48-hour ultimatum. William Kensington was a man gasping for his final breaths of air, but he refused to drown quietly. Instead of preparing for his inevitable bankruptcy, he decided to throw a spectacular illusion. By Saturday evening, the grand ballroom of the prestigious Pierre Hotel was dripping in imported white orchids and vintage crystal. William billed the event as an exclusive emergency fundraising gala for the Kensington Foundation. But every single shark on Wall Street knew the truth. It was a desperate, pathetic plea for a private bailout. He was hoping to trick one of his wealthy peers into handing him $100 million before the markets opened on Monday. Jamal was entirely in his element. He stood near the towering champagne fountain wearing a custom velvet tuxedo that I was absolutely certain he had charged to one of Chloe's maxed-out credit cards. He held a crystal flute in one hand and wrapped his other arm around his wife, projecting the image of a powerful, aristocratic heir. He was smiling for the society photographers, laughing at jokes he did not understand, and desperately pretending that the ground beneath his feet was not actively crumbling. He had traded his soul for a front-row seat on the Titanic, and he was determined to enjoy the music while the ship went down. I stepped through the gilded double doors of the ballroom right as the string quartet began playing a new movement. I did not wear my usual understated corporate attire. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that swept the floor, a piece of quiet, absolute power that immediately drew the eyes of everyone in the room. I was not crashing the party. I had been officially invited as the anonymous guest of honor. The organizers had been told that the primary shareholder of Vanguard Holdings might make a rare public appearance to observe the charity auction. No one in that room knew my face, but they were about to. It took exactly 4 minutes for Chloe to spot me. I was standing near a display of silent auction items when her sharp, manicured fingernails dug into Jamal's arm. I watched from across the room as her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure visceral rage. She whispered something vicious to her husband, and then began marching directly toward me. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the polished marble floor, sounding like a ticking metronome. Jamal trailed behind her, looking nervously over his shoulder, terrified that someone might witness this confrontation. "What the hell are you doing here?" Chloe hissed the moment she was close enough. Her voice was trembling with unchecked fury. She looked me up and down, taking in my gown with a sneer of absolute disgust. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. "I am simply enjoying the evening, Chloe. It is a beautiful venue. It is a shame your family will not own it by Tuesday." Chloe's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. She stepped closer, her voice rising in volume, completely ignoring the wealthy guests who were beginning to turn their heads. "You are a psychotic stalker," she spat loudly. "You do not belong here. This is an exclusive event for actual society. This is not a soup kitchen for ghetto trash. You think because you scammed your way into a nice dress you can stand in the same room as my family. You are a poor black woman from the bottom of the barrel, and no amount of fake jewelry will ever cover up the stench of where you came from." The music seemed to dip in volume. The surrounding guests fell completely silent watching the spectacle. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. He was standing slightly behind his wife, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He looked like a trapped rat. I gave him one final opportunity, one last chance to act like a man, to defend the sister who had given up her entire youth so he could survive. "Jamal," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "are you going to let your wife speak to me this way?" Jamal swallowed hard, avoiding my eyes. He looked at the wealthy investors watching them. He looked at the velvet tuxedo he was wearing. He chose the illusion. "You need to leave, Nia," he muttered, his voice shaking. "You are embarrassing yourself. Just go back to your apartment before security gets involved. Do not ruin this night for us." A cold, absolute peace settled over me. The final emotional cord had been cut. Chloe did not wait for my response. She snapped her fingers aggressively, waving over two massive security guards stationed near the ballroom entrance. "Grab this woman," she ordered, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "She is a trespasser. She is harassing my family. Drag her out the back service doors and throw her in the alley where she belongs. If she fights back, call the police and have her arrested for trespassing." The two security guards stepped forward, their expressions rigid. They reached out their hands, ready to grab my arms and haul me away. But before their fingers could even graze the fabric of my gown, a booming, commanding voice shattered the tension in the room. "Do not touch her." The voice was so heavy with absolute authority that the security guards instantly froze, stepping back as if they had been physically struck. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Walking through the center of the ballroom was Marcus Sterling. He was the most powerful real estate billionaire on the entire eastern seaboard. He was a titan of industry, a man whose net worth made the Kensingtons look like absolute beggars. For the past 2 hours, William Kensington had been following Marcus around the ballroom, sweating profusely and practically begging him for a corporate bailout. William was right on Marcus's heels, his face flushed with panic. "Marcus, please," William stammered, trying to grab the billionaire's arm. "Please ignore this drama. This woman is just a disgruntled former employee trying to extort my daughter. Security is handling it. We can go to the private lounge and finalize the loan agreement right now. I will give you 40% equity." Marcus Sterling did not even look at William. He walked right past the desperate, sweating tycoon as if he was completely invisible. He ignored Chloe, who was standing with her mouth hanging open. He ignored Jamal, who looked like he was about to pass out. Marcus stopped directly in front of me. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. William Kensington wiped his forehead, staring in absolute shock as the billionaire he had been begging for financial salvation straightened his suit jacket and dipped his head in a deep, highly respectful bow. "Good evening, boss," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the dead, silent room. He offered me a warm, genuine smile. "The acquisition paperwork is completely finalized. We are just waiting for your signal to begin the liquidation." The absolute silence that followed Marcus Sterling's words was deafening. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that pressed against the eardrums of every single person in the grand ballroom. The string quartet had stopped playing mid-measure. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased entirely. Hundreds of the city's most elite socialites, wealthy investors and ruthless hedge fund managers stood completely frozen, staring at the center of the room. William Kensington looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His eyes darted frantically from Marcus to me, and then back to Marcus. His brain was violently rejecting the reality unfolding in front of him. The man who had spent the last 2 hours trailing Marcus like a desperate, starving dog was now watching that same billionaire treat me with the utmost reverence. Marcus turned slightly, gesturing toward me with an open, deferential hand. He projected his voice, ensuring that his words carried to every corner of the opulent space. "Allow me to formally introduce you, Mr. Kensington." Marcus said, his tone slicing through the tension like a newly sharpened blade. "This is Ms. Nia. She is the founder and chairman of the board of Vanguard Holdings. She is the woman you have been desperately trying to contact for the past 48 hours. And as of this morning, she is the person holding exactly 80% of your company's outstanding debt." A collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy onlookers. The whispers began almost instantly, spreading like a wildfire through the room. The elite investors William had invited to this emergency gala were suddenly looking at him not as a peer, but as a carcass waiting to be devoured. They smelled the blood in the water. Chloe stood frozen beside her father. The color drained from her face so rapidly that her heavy contouring looked like paint smeared across a ghost. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she stared at me. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat simply refused to work. The woman she had just spent 5 minutes screaming at, the woman she had just called ghetto trash and ordered security to throw into an alley, was the apex predator of their financial food chain. Jamal was entirely paralyzed. He stood rooted to the polished marble floor, his velvet tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap theatrical costume. He opened his mouth, but the only sound that escaped was a pathetic, broken stutter. He could not form a single coherent word. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation was finally crushing him. He had abandoned a sister who held enough power to buy and sell the entire Kensington bloodline 10 times over all so he could marry into a family of bankrupt frauds. William Kensington's survival instincts finally kicked in, overriding his shock. The arrogant sneer he had worn just moments before was entirely gone. His posture crumpled. The illusion of the untouchable real estate tycoon shattered, leaving behind a desperate, sweating old man staring down the barrel of total financial annihilation. He realized instantly that his aggressive intimidation tactics had completely failed. If he wanted to survive, he had to pivot. A wide, synthetic smile suddenly stretched across William's pale face. He let out a loud, forced laugh that echoed awkwardly in the silent room. He stepped forward, holding his hands up in a gesture of absolute surrender. "Nia," he said, his voice dripping with sudden, sickeningly sweet flattery. "My dear girl, what an incredible surprise. Why did you not just say something? Why all this secrecy? This is a tremendous misunderstanding, a terrible mix-up." He took another step toward me, his eyes wide and pleading. "You must forgive Chloe. She has been under so much stress with the wedding planning. She did not know who you were. But there is no need for this hostility. We are all on the same side here. We are family now. Jamal is my son-in-law. We are united by blood." William reached out his sweaty hand, attempting to grab my arm in a familiar paternal gesture. He wanted the crowd to see an alliance. He wanted his wealthy peers to believe that the Vanguard takeover was just an internal family restructuring. I did not step back. I did not flinch. As his fingers brushed the silk of my sleeve, I raised my hand and violently swatted his arm away. The sharp smack of my hand against his wrist echoed like a gunshot across the ballroom. William stumbled backward, clutching his arm, his fake smile instantly dropping. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice radiating pure, icy authority. "And do not ever use the word family in my presence again." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, forcing him to retreat further under the intense scrutiny of his peers. I looked him dead in the eyes, projecting absolute dominance. You do not get to claim me as family when it suits your bank account, William. You do not get to claim me as family 12 hours after you ordered your security guards to drag me out of your daughter's wedding. You do not get to claim me as family after you stood in my home and threatened to bankrupt me with a baseless cease and desist order. I gestured toward Jamal, who was visibly shaking near the champagne fountain. And as for your son-in-law, he is no brother of mine. He cut that cord the moment he stood by in silence and watched you humiliate me. He is exactly where he belongs. He is a parasite who leeched off my hard work for 10 years, and now he is attached to a host that is completely out of blood. You two deserve exactly what you are getting. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Investors who had been considering writing William a check were now quietly slipping their checkbooks back into their tailored jackets. The facade of the emergency fundraising gala had been entirely dismantled. William's face turned a violent shade of crimson. The public humiliation was stripping away the last remaining shreds of his dignity. He looked around the room, seeing the disgusted and mocking faces of his supposed friends. He turned back to me, his voice dropping to a frantic, desperate whisper. Please, Nia, I am begging you. Do not do this here. Do not do this in front of everyone. Give me an extension. Give me a week. If you crash my stock today, thousands of people will lose their jobs. My legacy will be wiped out. I will lose everything. I folded my arms and stared at him with complete apathy. Your legacy was built on fraud, William. Your legacy was built on embezzlement, over-leveraged assets, and a sick, desperate need to project a wealth you did not actually possess. You threw this pathetic gala to trick these investors into bailing out your sinking ship. But the ship is already at the bottom of the ocean. Vanguard Holdings does not grant extensions to criminals. Chloe finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She lunged forward, her face twisted with a mixture of terror and furious entitlement. You cannot do this, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You cannot take our money. This is our life. You are just a jealous, bitter woman trying to steal what belongs to us. I did not even look at her. I kept my eyes locked entirely on William, watching the absolute defeat settle into his bones. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single folded sheet of heavy legal paper. I held it up between two fingers, letting the bright light of the crystal chandeliers illuminate the thick black ink. You seem to misunderstand the timeline of your own destruction, William, I said, my voice echoing cleanly across the massive room. You are standing here busy threatening a woman, busy throwing temper tantrums, busy trying to swindle your friends out of their money. But you are far too late. I dropped the paper onto the floor right at his feet. I just signed the final foreclosure order for this exact country club, I announced, looking slowly around the grand ballroom. The asset transfer was completed exactly 4 minutes ago. This entire estate, the golf course, the hotel, and this ballroom now legally belong to Vanguard Holdings. The party is officially over. I invite the Kensington family to pack up their belongings and get off my property immediately. The heavy legal parchment hit the polished marble floor with a soft thud, but to the people standing in that grand ballroom it might as well have been a detonating bomb. The absolute finality of the document lay there staring up at William Kensington like a death warrant. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. The entire room was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the reversal. The elite investors who had spent the last 2 hours sipping champagne and pretending to care about William's charitable causes were now watching him with the cold, detached fascination of vultures circling a dying animal. Then the silence broke. Chloe snapped. The carefully maintained facade of the elegant, composed heiress vanished completely, giving way to pure, hysterical panic. She spun around and lunged at Jamal. Her acrylic nails dug viciously into the lapels of his custom velvet tuxedo. She shoved him backward so hard he stumbled against the edge of the champagne fountain, causing several crystal flutes to tip and crash to the floor. You said she was a cleaner, Chloe shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. You told my father she was a bottom-feeding nobody who begged you for rent money. You lied to my family. You told us she was a pathetic spinster. Jamal raised his hands, trying frantically to shield his face from his wife's aggressive slapping. He looked around the ballroom, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The wealthy investors he had spent all night trying to impress were now openly pointing at him. Some were shaking their heads in disgust, while others were outright laughing at the spectacle. The realization that he was the punchline to the greatest financial joke of the decade finally crushed whatever remained of his manufactured ego. "You brought this monster into our lives!" Chloe screamed, hitting his chest with her closed fists. "You did not even know who she was. You ruined us. You ruined everything." Jamal shoved her hands away and stumbled forward. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his ruined tuxedo. He looked at William, who was still staring blankly at the foreclosure notice on the floor. He looked at the guards who were closing in. Finally, his desperate, panicked eyes locked onto me. He saw his only remaining lifeline. He saw the ultimate source of wealth he had blindly discarded. He closed the distance between us and threw himself to his knees right at my feet. He reached out and grabbed my bare hand, his palm slick with cold, terrified sweat. "Sister," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Sister, please." "I did not know. I swear to God I did not know. Please save me. You have to save me. I am your blood. Tell them to stop." I looked down at the hands gripping mine. I felt a surge of absolute visceral revulsion. I ripped my hand out of his grasp with such sudden force that he nearly pitched forward onto his face. I stared down at him with an expression so cold it could have frozen the harbor. "Sister." I repeated the word, tasting like toxic ash in my mouth. "On your wedding night, you called me an uneducated freeloader to please them. You stood in my kitchen and told me I was bottom-tier trash who would never belong in your elite world. You watched these people throw me out on the street and you smiled. You chose their fake pedigree over the woman who gave up her life to feed you. You cut off your own roots, Jamal. Do not ever call me sister again." Jamal collapsed backward, sitting on his heels as the finality of my words struck him. He opened his mouth to beg again, but Marcus Sterling raised a single finger. The 4 massive security guards in dark suits moved in immediately. They did not ask politely. They did not offer to show them to the coat check. They grabbed William Kensington by his arms, lifting him bodily from the floor. They grabbed Chloe by the waist of her designer gown, ignoring her frantic scratching and screaming. They grabbed Jamal by the collar of his velvet jacket, hauling him upward like a discarded piece of luggage. The wealthy elite of the city stepped back, parting like the Red Sea. They watched in absolute silence as the Kensington family was physically dragged across the length of the ballroom, kicking and crying all the way to the heavy gilded service doors. The doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off Chloe's shrieks and leaving the ballroom in perfect, serene quiet. Marcus turned to me, a slight satisfied smile playing on his lips. He offered me his arm. "Shall we enjoy the rest of the evening, boss?" he asked smoothly. I took his arm, looking around at the terrified, respectful faces of the remaining guests. "Let us review the new property, Marcus. I believe it needs a thorough cleaning." The sun rose the next morning on a completely different city. The Kensington Empire was officially bleeding out in the streets. The financial news networks were running continuous coverage of the Vanguard Holdings hostile takeover. Stock prices were plummeting. Creditors were circling. The Kensington name, which had opened every single door in the city for 3 generations, was now completely radioactive. But cornered animals do not die quietly. By 8 o'clock that morning, William Kensington convened an emergency board meeting on the top floor of his corporate headquarters. The room smelled of stale coffee and raw panic. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week. His expensive silk tie was pulled loose. His eyes were bloodshot, deeply sunken and manic. His hands trembled as he paced the length of the long mahogany table, staring down at the 7 terrified executives who had not yet tendered their resignations. The room was silent save for the sound of William's frantic breathing. The executives looked at each other, communicating their shared belief that their chairman had finally lost his mind. They were waiting for him to announce the bankruptcy filing. They were waiting for him to surrender the keys to Vanguard. Instead, William stopped pacing. He planted his hands on the edge of the mahogany table and leaned forward, a vicious, unhinged smile stretching across his pale face. "Vanguard thinks they have won," he hissed, his voice raspy and echoing in the large room. "That arrogant woman thinks she holds all the cards. She thinks because she bought our debt, she can simply walk in here and erase my family. She thinks I am just going to roll over and hand her the keys to my kingdom." He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed manila folder. He slapped it down onto the center of the table with a loud crack that made two of the executives flinch. "She missed something," William said, tapping his index finger against the folder. She was so focused on buying up the commercial loans and seizing the real estate collateral that she missed a crucial foundational clause in the original Kensington corporate charter. She missed the one hidden piece of leverage that can completely invalidate this entire hostile takeover. The lead legal counsel. A nervous man sweating through his collar leaned forward cautiously. "William, what are you talking about?" "Vanguard holds 80% of the debt. The banks have locked our accounts. We are entirely insolvent. There is no legal maneuver that can stop a direct margin call of this magnitude." William let out a dark, breathless laugh. He opened the folder and slid a yellowed, heavily redacted document across the table. He pointed to a specific paragraph buried deep within the legal jargon. "I am not letting a ghetto upstart steal my legacy." William growled, his eyes wide and completely deranged. "I am going to use this clause to freeze her assets, trap her in litigation for a decade, and bleed Vanguard dry. We are going to destroy her." The atmosphere inside the glass-walled boardroom of the Kensington Group was suffocating. The air smelled of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and raw, visceral panic. I stood just outside the reinforced double doors, flanked by my lead litigators and a private security detail. Through the pristine glass, I watched William Kensington perform his final pathetic trick. He was standing at the head of the long mahogany table, sweating profusely, but projecting a manic, unhinged confidence. He had just thrown a yellowed, heavily redacted document onto the table. He was desperately trying to convince his remaining board members that he held a secret weapon. I could hear his voice muffled but sharp through the glass. He called it a foundational poison pill. He claimed the original corporate charter from decades ago prevented hostile takeovers by unapproved entities. He boasted that he could use this archaic clause to freeze Vanguard Holdings in litigation for 10 years. Chloe was sitting to his right, her chin tilted up, trying desperately to project the aristocratic arrogance she no longer possessed. Jamal sat to his left, staring blankly at his own hands, looking exactly like a prisoner awaiting execution. William paced the length of the room, his voice rising in arrogant triumph. He told his terrified executives that I was nothing but a street hustler playing a game designed by kings. He sneered and declared that money could not buy class, and it certainly could not buy legal fluency. He promised them he was going to bury me. I gave a slight nod to my lead counsel. I pushed the heavy glass doors open. They did not creak. They swung wide with a heavy, expensive swoosh that instantly drew every single eye in the room. My legal team fanned out behind me, moving in perfect synchronization. They formed a solid wall of tailored navy suits and absolute undeniable authority. As I walked down the length of the boardroom, the visual shift was striking. The terrified executives in the foreground scrambled to their feet, knocking over their heavy leather chairs in their haste to back away from the table. In the background, the manic, triumphant color rapidly drained from William's face. The changing perspective as I moved forward made Chloe and Jamal appear smaller and smaller with every deliberate step I took. It was a flawless execution of power. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I walked directly to the opposite end of the mahogany table and placed my hands flat on the polished wood, mirroring William's stance, but projecting complete icy calm. "That is a fascinating piece of history, William," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the dead silence. "Clause Section 4, Paragraph 9 of your grandfather's original charter. It is a brilliant defensive mechanism designed to protect legacy assets from hostile outside acquisition." William puffed out his chest, his manic confidence returning for a fraction of a second. "You should have read the fine print before you tried to seize my company, Miss Vanguard," he spat. "You are locked out. The board is activating the poison pill right now. You just lost your $100 million. Money cannot buy the legal fluency required to beat my family. I offered him a smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. I snapped my fingers. My lead counsel stepped forward and slid a pristine black legal binder across the smooth length of the table. It glided perfectly, stopping exactly an inch away from William's trembling hands. "I did read the fine print, William," I replied. "I read every single syllable. That specific clause requires the unanimous vote of all majority shareholders holding Class A voting stock to activate. It was explicitly designed to keep outsiders out. But I'm not an outsider anymore." William frowned, his eyes darting to the black binder. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "You do not hold Class A voting stock, you hold our commercial debt." "I hold both," I corrected smoothly. "Because last night, while you were busy digging through the dusty archives looking for a magic spell to save your bankrupt empire, your 3 largest shareholders came to my hotel suite. They were terrified by the federal raid on your offices. They were terrified of going to federal prison for your endless embezzlement. So I made them a very generous offer. I bought all of their Class A voting stock at a 20% premium. I now hold 60% of the voting rights in this room. You do not have the votes to activate your little poison pill. Your grandfather's shield just became your coffin." The remaining executives at the table began whispering frantically to each other, grabbing their briefcases and inching toward the door. William collapsed backward into his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at the executives, who completely refused to meet his eyes. He realized in that exact second that he was utterly surrounded and entirely defeated. "You cannot do this," Chloe shrieked suddenly, standing up and slapping her hands flat on the table. "You are breaking the law. You are stealing from us. We will sue you until you have nothing left. We are the Kensingtons." I turned my gaze slowly to Chloe. The sheer blind entitlement radiating from her was almost fascinating to witness. She still genuinely believed her last name was a magical protective shield. She still believed she was completely untouchable. "You are going to sue me with what money?" "Chloe," I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Your father's corporate and personal accounts are completely frozen by the federal government. Your personal trust fund was liquidated yesterday afternoon to cover the initial margin call. Your credit cards have been declined across the entire city. You cannot even afford the valet parking fee for your repossessed sports car." Chloe's face twisted in violent rage. "I have a husband," she spat, gesturing wildly toward Jamal. "He is a partner at his law firm. We will use his income. We will use his assets to destroy you. You will regret the day you ever touched my family." I looked at Jamal. He was gripping his head in his hands, refusing to look at his wife, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at anyone. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew there was no partner income. He knew his entire career, his entire fake aristocratic existence had been built entirely on my money and my sacrifices. I reached into the leather briefcase held by my assistant. I did not pull out another corporate document. I did not pull out a bank statement. I pulled out a thick bound contract with several prominent signatures on the final page. I held it up, letting the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom reflect off the glossy cover. I tossed the document onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, undeniable thud right between Chloe and Jamal. "I highly doubt you will be using your husband's assets for anything, Chloe," I said, my voice laced with absolute finality. "Because I hold those too." William leaned forward, squinting at the document. Chloe stared at it, her confusion rapidly morphing into fresh panic. "That," I announced, my voice echoing perfectly off the glass walls, "is the prenuptial agreement you forced Jamal to sign exactly 1 month before your lavish wedding. It is a very thorough document, William. You made sure to protect every single cent of your precious Kensington empire in the event of a divorce. You stipulated that Jamal would walk away with absolutely nothing. No alimony, no property, no spousal support." Chloe lifted her chin defensively, her voice shaking. "That is standard procedure for a family of our status. It means his debts are his own and my money is mine." "Exactly," I smiled, stepping closer to the table. Your money is yours, or rather it was, but you missed a very interesting addendum buried deep in the liabilities section of that specific contract. You see, William was so eager to protect his own assets that he demanded a full legal disclosure of Jamal's financial obligations before allowing the marriage to proceed. I walked slowly around the table, standing directly behind Jamal's chair. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably under his expensive suit jacket. Jamal had to prove he was debt-free to marry into your elite family, I continued, placing my hands lightly on the back of his leather chair. But Jamal was not debt-free. He owed a massive amount of money to a private lender who had financed his entire Ivy League education, his Manhattan loft, and his luxury lifestyle. A lender he desperately needed to pay off to maintain his fake aristocratic image for you. Chloe looked down at her husband, her voice trembling with sudden dread. Jamal, what is she talking about? You told my father your trust fund covered everything. There is no trust fund, Chloe, I stated sharply, shattering the illusion once and for all. There is only me. I was his bank. And when your father demanded a clean balance sheet, Jamal came to me begging for a total debt forgiveness contract. He wanted me to legally erase the millions he owed me so he could sign your perfect prenuptial agreement with a zero balance. I pointed to the document resting on the mahogany wood. I agreed to erase his debt on one very specific condition. I drafted a secondary clause attached directly to this prenuptial agreement. A clause Jamal signed without reading carefully because he was too blinded by the glare of your fake society status to see the trap. William's hands were shaking violently as he reached for the document, flipping rapidly through the heavy pages until he found the attached addendum. His eyes scanned the dense legal text, and all the remaining blood completely drained from his face. What does it say? Chloe demanded, her voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. Dad, what does it say? William could not speak. He just stared at the paper, his mouth hanging open, his breathing shallow and rapid. I will save you the trouble of translating the legalese, I said, my voice cold and absolute. The clause states that if the Kensington Group ever falls into insolvency, or if William Kensington is ever investigated for federal fraud, Jamal's total financial debt to me is immediately reinstated. But it is not just reinstated. It is legally transferred. I leaned forward, resting my palms flat on the table, locking eyes with a terrified Chloe. By signing that prenuptial agreement, you legally bound yourself to his hidden liabilities in the event of a corporate default. You thought you were protecting your money from him, but you actually signed as the primary guarantor of his debt to me. Chloe stumbled backward, her heavy chair scraping loudly against the floor. No, she gasped, shaking her head frantically. No, that is impossible. My father's lawyers reviewed everything. They checked everything. Your father's lawyers were paid off by your father to rush the paperwork, so you could have your fairy tale wedding, I replied ruthlessly. They did not check the secondary filings. You are legally responsible for every single dollar Jamal borrowed from me. You owe Vanguard Holdings $7 million, Chloe. Payable immediately. Jamal finally looked up, tears streaming down his face, his expression completely shattered. He reached out toward me. Naya, please, he choked out. You are destroying her. You are destroying us. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my jacket. I looked down at the three broken people sitting in the ruins of their own arrogance. You destroyed yourselves, I stated, turning my back on them and facing the remaining terrified board members. This building is mine. This company is mine. Your debts are mine. The meeting is adjourned. I invite the Kensington family to pack up their belongings and get out of my building immediately. William slammed his fist onto the mahogany table with such force that a glass water pitcher rattled against its tray. He did not move toward the door. The sheer terror in his eyes was rapidly transforming into the frantic, cornered rage of an animal fighting for its life. You think you have entirely won? He spat, his chest heaving, as he glared at me across the length of the boardroom. You think acquiring a bankrupt corporate entity gives you total victory? You are nothing but a glorified debt collector. You can take this building. You can take the company name. But my personal wealth is completely insulated. The Kensington family fortune is locked in offshore trusts and dummy corporations that your legal team will never be able to trace. I will rebuild while you choke on the toxic assets you just bought. I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate words hang in the heavy air. I looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. Your offshore trusts are not a secret, William, I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. The federal investigators currently tearing through your accounting department downstairs know exactly where the stolen money is hidden. They know about the shell companies in the Caymans. They know about the fraudulent wire transfers. They know about the massive tax evasion. William let out a harsh, barking laugh. His manic smile returned, stretching his face into a terrifying mask. Let them look, he sneered. Let the federal agents tear this building down to the foundation. They will not find a single piece of paper linking me to those accounts. My signature is nowhere near those illegal transfers. I am legally untouchable. I did not break eye contact with him. I slowly shifted my gaze to Jamal. Jamal was staring at his father-in-law, a deep, terrible confusion washing over his tear-stained face. He had been promised a life of effortless luxury. He had been promised a seat at the table of the city's most elite family. He was only just beginning to realize the actual price of his admission. You are absolutely right, William, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward Jamal. Your signature is nowhere to be found. The feds will not arrest you for the shell companies, because you made sure someone else held the pen. I snapped my fingers again. My lead litigator immediately opened a sleek leather folder and extracted a thick stack of heavily notarized contracts. He placed them directly in front of Jamal. Look at them, I commanded. Jamal stared blindly at the papers. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely turn the first page. 2 months ago, William Kensington offered you the title of Vice President of Global Acquisitions. I stated, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent boardroom. You thought it was a wedding gift. You thought it was proof a wedding gift. You thought it was proof that you had finally been accepted into high society. You bragged to me that you were finally a man of status. You sat in my penthouse and told me you were better than me because the Kensingtons saw your true value. Jamal flipped to the signature pages. His breathing became incredibly shallow. His eyes darted across the text, reading the brutal, undeniable truth written in black and white. You signed a mountain of corporate paperwork without reading a single clause. I continued, closing the distance until I was standing directly over his shoulder. You were so blinded by your desperate, pathetic need to be wealthy that you signed away your life. Those documents did not make you a vice president, Jamal. They made you the primary legal signatory for every single shell corporation William used to embezzle funds. They made you the sole liable party for his massive tax fraud. Jamal looked up at William, his face a mask of pure visceral horror. William did not look back. The disgraced tycoon stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes cold and entirely unbothered. I looked down at the boy I had raised, the brother who had thrown me away like garbage. I spoke the words clearly and deliberately, ensuring they cut straight down to the bone. Did you really think a family that built their entire legacy on exclusion and elitism was going to welcome a poor black man from the bottom of the city with open arms? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Did you actually believe William Kensington saw you as an equal? He never saw you as a son, Jamal. He never saw you as family. He saw you as the perfect, disposable scapegoat. They needed a fall guy to take the prison sentence for their financial crimes, and you walked right into the slaughterhouse begging for a collar. Jamal let out a choked, agonizing gasp. The velvet tuxedo he wore no longer looked like a symbol of wealth. It looked like a prison uniform. He scrambled backward, his chair tipping over and crashing onto the floor. He stumbled toward his wife, grabbing her shoulders with desperate, frantic hands. Chloe, he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob. Chloe, tell me this is a lie. Tell me your father did not do this. We are married. I am your husband. You have to tell them the truth. Tell the lawyers I did not know about the accounts. Chloe stood perfectly still. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She looked at the man she had sworn to love and honor, and her face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute ice. She reached up and violently shoved his hands off her shoulders. "Stop touching me," she snapped, brushing her designer jacket as if his very presence had soiled the fabric. Jamal froze, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Chloe, please," he whimpered. "I did everything for you. I gave up my sister for you. I turned my back on my own blood so I could be with you. You have to save me." Chloe let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Save you?" she repeated, her voice dripping with total revulsion. "You were an insurance policy, Jamal. A pathetic, gullible insurance policy. My father needed a clean name to attach to the liability accounts, and you were desperate enough to sign anything we put in front of you. Did you honestly believe I married you for love? Did you think I actually wanted to spend the rest of my life with a broke nobody who had to beg his sister to buy his engagement ring?" She stepped closer to him, leaning in so he could hear every single devastating syllable. "We needed a fool to take the fall when the market crashed. You played your part perfectly. But the money is gone now. The game is over. You are absolutely useless to me." The profound silence that followed her words was heavier than gravity. Jamal stared at his wife, his entire reality disintegrating into ash. The high society dream he had sold his soul to achieve was a meticulously crafted nightmare. He had abandoned the only person in the world who had truly loved him to walk willingly into a cage designed by racists who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient human shield. He fell to his knees in the center of the boardroom. He wrapped his arms around his stomach, rocking back and forth, letting out a low, guttural wail of total psychological collapse. He looked up at me, tears and sweat streaming down his face. "Nia," he screamed, reaching out a trembling hand toward me. "Sister, please. You have to help me. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. Please do not let them send me to prison. Please save me. You are my sister." I looked down at his outstretched hand. I did not move a single muscle. The camera of my memory flashed back to the night of his wedding. I remembered standing on the curb in the freezing rain, humiliated and discarded, while he stood inside the warm, glowing ballroom sipping champagne with the people who had just thrown me out. "I am not your sister," I stated, my voice entirely devoid of warmth. "On the night of your wedding, you called me an uneducated freeloader to impress these people. You stood in my living room and told me I would always be bottom-tier trash. You willingly severed the roots that kept you alive, Jamal. You chose the Kensingtons. Now you get to die with them." William Kensington slammed both his hands on the table, his face purple with explosive rage. The realization that I was utterly unmovable, that I was not going to save my brother, and by extension save him, completely shattered his final shred of sanity. "Get out!" he roared, his voice echoing violently against the glass walls. "Get out of my building. You think you can walk in here and play God with my family? I am still William Kensington. I am still the chairman of this board." He spun around wildly, pointing a shaking finger at the double doors. "Security!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. "Security, get in here right now! Arrest this woman! Drag her out of this room! Drag her down the stairs! Get her out of my sight!" The remaining executives shrank back against the walls, terrified of the unhinged billionaire. William kept screaming, demanding his guards, demanding his authority, demanding a world that no longer existed. I did not raise my voice. I did not call for my own guards. I simply reached into the pocket of my emerald silk gown and pulled out my mobile phone. I held his furious, bloodshot gaze as I raised the device and pressed a single silver button on the screen. The massive frosted glass wall positioned directly behind William Kensington instantly darkened, shifting from a translucent privacy shield into a high-definition projection screen. It roared to life with a sharp electronic hum. I did not project a simple presentation. I projected a graveyard of financial crimes. Row after row of heavily encrypted financial data flooded the screen, illuminating the dark boardroom in a harsh, unforgiving blue light. The data displayed bank routing numbers from the Cayman Islands. It showed shell company registrations in Panama. It displayed millions of dollars in wire transfers routed through anonymous accounts in Geneva. Beside those offshore records, the screen displayed the Kensington Group's internal corporate tax filings from the past decade. The juxtaposition was entirely irrefutable. The screen laid bare a massive systemic operation of tax evasion, embezzlement, and money laundering. I kept my phone in my hand and looked directly at the terrified executives sitting around the table. When Vanguard Holdings purchased your commercial debt, we demanded full access to your digital archives for our standard valuation procedures. I explained, my voice echoing cleanly in the dead silence of the room. Your cybersecurity was aggressively outdated. My forensic accounting team spent the last 72 hours tearing through your hidden servers. We traced every single missing dollar, every fraudulent loan, and every inflated asset right back to William's private estate. I tapped the screen of my phone, and the projection shifted. It zoomed in on a specific sequence of transfers, highlighting the numbers in glaring neon red. The screen now displayed the exact dates William transferred employee pension funds into his personal offshore trusts. It showed how he deliberately bled his own subsidiaries dry to finance his luxury properties, his private jets, and his daughter's multi-million-dollar wedding. I made sure the digital signatures, the IP addresses, and the exact paper trail were blown up to a massive scale. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that William orchestrated every single illegal maneuver himself, while meticulously setting up Jamal as the blind signatory to take the fall. The silence in the boardroom was completely shattered by the collective frantic gasps of the remaining shareholders. These were the men who had spent their entire lives protecting William Kensington. They were the elite white old money gatekeepers who had sneered at me when I first entered the building. They were the men who preached about corporate legacy and high society values. But loyalty in their insulated world was only as strong as the nearest profit margin. The moment they saw the federal evidence displayed on the wall, the moment they realized the scope of the fraud, they scrambled for safety, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The oldest board member, a man who had served as William's mentor and godfather figure, stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the floor. He pointed a shaking, liver-spotted finger at William. His face was twisted in an expression of pure, absolute disgust. "You lied to us, William," the old man barked, his voice trembling with self-righteous indignation. "You assured this board that the federal inquiry was a simple clerical misunderstanding. You used our names to shield your thievery. The board has absolutely no knowledge of these fraudulent activities. We disavow you entirely." Another executive, a man who had just minutes ago been nodding along to William's arrogant speech, grabbed his leather briefcase and shoved his chair away from the table. "I am contacting the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately," he announced loudly, ensuring everyone in the room heard his declaration of innocence. "I am turning over all my internal communications to the authorities. I will not go to federal prison for your sick greed, William." They were literally tripping over each other in their frantic haste to distance themselves from the Kensington name. They recognized that the federal agents were currently tearing apart the accounting department downstairs. They knew the only way to avoid wearing handcuffs themselves was to serve William to the authorities on a silver platter. William shouted at them. He slammed his hands against the table, demanding their loyalty. He screamed that he had made them all rich, that they owed him their careers and their fortunes. But they completely ignored him. They marched out of the heavy glass doors, pulling out their cell phones to call their private defense attorneys without offering him a single backward glance. They abandoned him exactly as he had planned to abandon Jamal. Within 60 seconds, the boardroom was entirely empty, save for my legal team, my security detail, and the 3 broken remnants of the Kensington dynasty. William stood trembling violently at the head of the table. His chest heaved erratically, and his face had turned a dangerous mottled shade of gray. The sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes. He looked at the massive screen displaying his undeniable crimes, and then he looked at me. The reality of his situation finally crushed him. He had nothing left. No allies, no money, no hidden leverage, no legacy. I stepped right up to the edge of the mahogany table. I placed both of my hands flat against the polished wood and leaned forward. The overhead lighting caught my posture, casting my long, dark shadow directly across the surface of the table until it completely enveloped William in darkness. I looked directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes, projecting absolute lethal dominance. "You stood in my kitchen and asked me what gave me the right to enter your world, William," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, steady register that demanded total submission. "You asked me who I thought I was, and told me I had no standing to challenge you. You once asked me what gave me the right. My right is that of the person who just signed the executive order firing you from your position as chairman of this board. I own this company. I own your debts. I own your legacy. Pack your belongings and get out of my building." William Kensington did not scream this time. He did not threaten me with his lawyers or his fake prestige. The absolute finality of my words struck him like a physical blow to the chest. The false bravado and the decades of aristocratic arrogance simply evaporated from his body, leaving behind nothing but an empty, fragile shell. His knees buckled. He slumped forward, crashing heavily onto the mahogany table. He buried his face in his folded arms, letting out a ragged, broken wheeze that echoed pitifully in the vast, quiet space. The untouchable king of real estate was officially reduced to a crying, trembling old man, waiting for the federal agents to walk through the doors and put him in handcuffs. Seeing her father physically collapse finally broke Chloe's fragile grip on reality. The realization that she was no longer a billionaire heiress, that her platinum credit cards were useless, and her elite social standing was dead, drove her into a state of pure, unadulterated hysteria. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of desperate panic. She spun around and grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his ruined velvet tuxedo. She shook him violently, her long acrylic nails digging into his shoulders. "Do something!" she shrieked, her voice scraping painfully against the glass walls. "You are a lawyer. You went to an Ivy League school. Find a loophole in that prenuptial agreement. File a federal injunction. You have to fix this, Jamal. We cannot be poor. I cannot be poor. You promised me you knew how to handle these things. Do your job and save us." Jamal stared at her with dead, hollow eyes. He looked at the woman he had sold his soul to marry. He looked at the woman who had just minutes ago told him she never loved him and had only used him as a disposable insurance policy to protect her family's stolen wealth. He realized that even now, as their entire world burned to the ground, she still viewed him as nothing more than a tool to serve her needs. He reached up and slowly, deliberately pried her manicured fingers off his jacket. He pushed her away with a look of absolute revulsion, shoving her backward so she stumbled against the edge of the table. "There is no loophole, Chloe," he said, his voice completely empty of emotion. "There is no injunction. I am not a real partner at that firm, and you know it. We are finished." Jamal turned his back on his weeping wife. His shoulders slumped forward, entirely crushed by the weight of his own monumental betrayal. He looked at William sobbing on the table. He looked at the massive screen detailing the fraud he had blindly signed his name to. Then he turned his gaze to me. He fell to his knees in the center of the boardroom. He crawled across the expensive imported carpet until he was right at the tips of my designer shoes. He did not care about his dignity anymore. He did not care about his tailored suit or the fake aristocratic accent he had spent years perfecting. He was staring down the barrel of a $7 million debt inherited from his wife's fraudulent family, a debt that would trap him in crippling poverty for the rest of his natural life. He was looking at total, absolute ruin. "Nia," he begged, tears pouring down his face and dripping onto the floor near my feet. "Nia, please. I am begging you on my hands and knees. I know I was wrong. I know I was a monster to you. But please do not enforce the prenup clause. Do not make me pay William's debt. I will do anything you want. I will work for you for free for the rest of my life. I will clean your floors. I will be your servant. Just save me from this contract. Please, sister, save me from them." The heavy mahogany doors did not open for the building security William was frantically summoning. They swung inward with a heavy thud to reveal a completely different kind of authority. 5 agents wearing dark windbreakers bearing the stark yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped into the boardroom. They did not look impressed by the imported carpets or the crystal chandeliers. They looked entirely bored by the billionaire throwing a temper tantrum. The lead agent produced a heavily stamped warrant and slapped it onto the table right next to the damning prenuptial agreement. William's voice simply died in his throat. The transformation from an untouchable titan of industry into a common criminal happened in the span of 3 seconds. He tried to step backward, but his legs refused to hold him. 2 agents flanked him immediately, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the glass-walled room sounded louder than any scream. William Kensington, the man who believed his name was a shield against consequences, was read his rights and dragged out the door, his expensive leather shoes dragging across his own polished floor. Jamal watched the absolute destruction of his idol in paralyzed silence. The man he had sold his soul to emulate the man whose approval he had traded his own sister for was gone. The illusion shattered completely, leaving Jamal staring at the terrifying reality of his situation. He was legally bound to a $7 million debt. He was tied to a disgraced, toxic family. He had absolutely nothing. He turned his wide, terrified eyes back to me. He was still on his knees, the expensive fabric of his custom velvet tuxedo pooling around him on the floor. He crawled forward again, dragging himself across the carpet until his chest hit the tips of my shoes. He looked up, and I saw the desperate, manipulative little boy I had spent my entire adult life protecting. "Sister, please, you have to listen to me," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, wet sob. "They brainwashed me, Nia. They made me believe I had to cut you off to survive in this world. You know me. You know who I really am inside. We are the only family we have left. Mom and Dad are gone, and it has always been just you and me against the world." He reached out and tried to grasp the hem of my dress, but his hands were shaking too violently. "Do you remember the apartment on the south side?" he pleaded, tears streaming rapidly down his face. "Do you remember when the heating broke and we had to sleep in our coats? You wrapped your blankets around me so I would not freeze. You worked the graveyard shifts so I could have new shoes for school. You raised me, Nia. You are my mother and my father and my sister. You cannot do this to your own blood. I am a victim here just like you. They used my ambition against me. Please do not let them bury me under this debt. I will be ruined forever. I am your family. You are the only family I have." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping man clinging to my ankles. The emotional distance between us was vast and insurmountable. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The well of my compassion had run completely dry on the night he let his new family throw me out onto the freezing wet pavement. I kept my face entirely expressionless, my voice incredibly calm and perfectly level. It was the absolute silence of a storm that had already passed, leaving nothing but leveled ground in its wake. "You are absolutely right, Jamal." I stated, my words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. "I raised you. I starved so you could eat. I scrubbed floors so you could sit in Ivy League classrooms. I gave up my youth, my dreams, and my future to ensure you would never have to beg anyone for anything. I built a foundation of absolute sacrifice so you could stand tall. But that was my lesson. I taught you how to survive." I took a slow, deliberate half-step backward, forcing him to look up at me from a lower angle. I projected a terrifying, unwavering apathy. "The Kensington family taught you how to be a man," I continued. "They taught you that loyalty has a price tag. They taught you that blood is disposable when it becomes inconvenient. They taught you how to trade your soul for a luxury zip code. You chose their curriculum over mine. Now you get to pay for that lesson." I reached into my emerald silk clutch. My fingers brushed against a thick piece of cardstock. I pulled out a crisp white envelope and held it up between my index and middle finger. I tilted it slightly so the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom illuminated the bank seal on the front. I looked down at Jamal, whose eyes widened with a sudden desperate flicker of hope. "This envelope was in my hand on the night of your wedding," I explained softly, my voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room. I was standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the catering staff, waiting for the right moment to pull you aside and give you my gift. It is a certified cashier's check for $2 million. I liquidated the very first major asset Vanguard Holdings ever acquired to secure this money. It was meant to buy your freedom. It was meant to clear your debts so you could start your new life with a clean slate. I wanted you to walk into this marriage as an equal, not a servant. Jamal let out a choked, agonizing gasp. The color entirely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He reached up a trembling, desperate hand toward the envelope, but I stepped back out of his reach. I held his gaze as I gripped the top of the envelope. I pulled my hands apart, tearing the thick paper straight down the middle. Jamal screamed. It was a sharp, visceral sound of pure physical pain. He lunged upward, trying to grab my hands, but my security detail immediately stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall between us. I placed the torn halves together and tore them again. I tore the heavy paper into smaller and smaller squares until the $2 million lifeline was nothing but a handful of useless confetti. I opened my hand and let the pieces flutter down like snow settling onto his ruined tuxedo and the polished marble floor. "You wanted to be a Kensington," I whispered, looking down at the torn pieces scattered at his feet. "Congratulations, you finally got everything you asked for." I turned my back on him. I did not look at Chloe, who was staring at the torn check with wide, unblinking, horrified eyes. I did not look at the empty chairs left by the fleeing executives. I simply adjusted my posture, aligned my shoulders, and walked toward the glass doors. My legal team fell into step behind me, forming a silent, unified phalanx of absolute victory. We walked out of the boardroom, leaving the heavy glass doors wide open. As I stepped into the carpeted hallway, a profound sense of lightness washed over my entire body. The heavy chains of obligation, guilt, and unrequited familial loyalty shattered completely. I was finally free. Behind me, in the ruins of the Kensington Empire, the silence finally broke. Chloe unleashed a sound that was half shriek and half feral growl. The absolute loss of her wealth, her status, and her father completely broke her mind. She lunged across the space, separating her from her husband. Her hand connected with Jamal's cheek with a sickeningly loud crack. The slap echoed violently through the empty boardroom, bouncing off the glass walls. She hit him again and again, her acrylic nails tearing at his face. "You pathetic, useless parasite," she screamed, her voice cracking and raw. "You cost me everything. I lost my father because of you. I lost my money because of you. You are nothing but a disgusting liability." Jamal did not cower this time. The realization that his life was completely over, that he was trapped in a $7 million grave with a woman who openly despised him, snapped the last fragile thread of his sanity. He grabbed her wrists, twisting them violently as he shoved her backward against the mahogany table. "You think you are better than me?" he roared, his face twisted in absolute unhinged hatred. "You are nothing without your daddy's stolen money. You are just a spoiled, bankrupt little girl, and you are drowning right here with me. You belong in the dirt right next to me." They tore into each other, screaming vicious, ugly truths, tearing away the last remaining shreds of their dignity. The perfect high society couple, the golden heirs to a limitless fortune, were reduced to two feral animals biting and clawing at each other inside a glass cage. They were entirely consumed by the flames of their own supreme arrogance, leaving absolutely nothing behind but ash. 6 months later, the air in the city felt entirely different. The heavy, oppressive weight of the Kensington legacy had been completely scrubbed from the skyline. I stood on the grand lawn of what used to be the elite Kensington Country Club. The wrought iron gates that once kept people like me out had been torn down and permanently removed. In their place stood a massive bronze plaque bearing the name of the new Vanguard Foundation, an incubator and financial trust fully dedicated to funding young Black entrepreneurs from the city's South Side. The people who had built their lives on exclusion were now learning the brutal reality of consequence. William Kensington's federal trial was a relentless media spectacle. His offshore accounts were seized, his assets were liquidated, and he was currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting a sentencing that carried a minimum of 20 years. His precious high society friends had abandoned him before the ink on his indictment was even dry. Chloe Kensington no longer wore imported silk or diamond tennis bracelets. The bankruptcy courts had seized her trusts, leaving her with absolutely nothing. She now spent her days standing behind a glass counter at a mid-tier suburban shopping mall, wearing a polyester uniform and selling discounted perfume to the very people she used to mock. And Jamal. Jamal's desperate obsession to belong to a world that hated him had ultimately cost him everything. Chloe divorced him the moment the money ran out, leaving him legally chained to the millions in fraudulent liabilities he had blindly signed for. He was now working 3 separate minimum-wage manual labor jobs just to keep the collection agencies from throwing him in a debtor's prison. He lived in a cramped, windowless basement apartment a few blocks from the neighborhood he had been so eager to abandon. There were no more velvet tuxedos or Ivy League pretenses. There was only the crushing, endless exhaustion of a man who had traded his loyal sister for a counterfeit dream. I did not feel any lingering hatred for them. Hatred requires emotional investment, and I had none left to give. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute peace. I stepped out onto the glass balcony of my penthouse office at Vanguard Holdings. The wind caught the edge of my coat as I looked down at the sprawling metropolis below. The city lights began to flicker on, illuminating the streets and the towering buildings that now fell under my direct control. I rested my hands on the cool metal railing, feeling the quiet, unshakable strength of everything I had built from the ground up. They said I did not belong in their world. I stated, my voice carrying out into the evening air, steady and absolute. They were right. I do not belong in it. I own it. The screen fades to black.